getting the calculus changed by the Houthi seems to be a success if that's what they do. Now, that doesn't mean that the air blockade has finished. We don't know that part of it, so we don't know whether the Omani intercessions here were just in terms of the that part of the maritime tapestry rather than the Israel. I suspect it is.
Chip Chapman, thank you for joining The World in 10. I'm going to start with quite a long question, actually, so bear with me. But on Sunday, the Sunday Times defence and diplomacy columnist Mark Urban wrote a piece called "The Houthis Have the Upper Hand, This Is Why." And essentially it said the Houthis are more than a nuisance, with an arsenal that many nations would be proud of, that is costing the US and Israel huge amounts of cash, weaponry that will weaken them if they ended up having to go to war themselves at some point. And that the Houthis' continued attacks on Israel has seen, shipping traffic plunge in the area. So countries there are no longer able to receive vital resources. So this is actually a big dilemma for the West, who probably can't really destroy the Houthis without a land invasion, which I don't think the United States has any plan to do. So given that, and given that yesterday Donald Trump said the Houthis have agreed to stop their activities there, why would they do that if they're causing so many problems?
Well, I think you have to first understand what deterrence is, and you can either deter by punishment or you can deter by denial. And since the 15th of March, we've had Operation Rough Rider from the Americans, where US Central Command were ordered by Donald Trump to wage decisive and powerful strikes on the Houthis, so long as they continue to target shipping in the Red Sea. And what it would seem from Trump's announcement when he was alongside Carney yesterday is that it has been decisive in altering the calculus of the Houthis. So the Houthis say that they want to stop fighting, and therefore the Americans have called off the airstrikes. So in the words of Rubio, they've capitulated. And Rubio also posited this as a freedom of navigation issue. Now, the Houthi really had two objectives. The first one was an air blockade of Israel. That may be still ongoing because this may just be a freedom of navigation issue. And the second issue was a sea blockade. Now, although they said this was just supposed to be against Israeli assets, the complexity of the international maritime tapestry, particularly in terms of flag registration and ownerships, means that a number of other nations have been caught up in this. And more importantly, it was a 55% drop in shipping through the Red Sea, having impacts, for example, on possible stability in Egypt, which had a $10 billion a year fall in revenue. So getting the calculus changed by the Houthi seems to be a success if that's what they do. Now, that doesn't mean that the air blockade has finished. We don't know that part of it. So we don't know whether the Omani intercessions here were just in terms of the that part of the maritime tapestry rather than the Israel. I suspect it is. But of course, ongoing at the moment, we have the talks between Iran and America. And in the last week, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of State for Defense, has warned Iran that we know that the Houthis are supplied by you. We've always known that. They give about $100 billion a year. And that will be coming for you at a time and place of our choosing if you don't get them to alter the calculus. So I suspect that also has played into it because, again, Donald Trump has a hard stop, or so he said he has, on the negotiations with Iran, which are due to conclude by the end of March. So I don't think Mark was completely correct in this instance. And that's one of the problems with futurology. It tends to be out of date quite quickly.
If the Houthis do continue their attacks on Israel, but stop those that, that Donald Trump seems to be satisfied they're now going to stop, and then America does leave the Houthis alone, does that signify that Trump is putting greater stock on a nuclear deal with Iran than actually defending Israel? That would seem like a huge American policy twist.
I don't think it's necessarily a policy twist. I think you have to, again, look at the position of the Houthis and Iran together, along with all the other parts of the axis of resistance. I mean, the Houthis were part of this unity of fronts with, the Hamas and Hezbollah, those have been severely degraded. And in the words of Jim Mattis, when I was there in America with Central Command, that the loss of Syria to Iran would be the greatest strategic setback since the Iranian Revolution. So Iran are on the back foot. The issue really the big issue in the talks with Iran is whether America goes to a maximalist approach. Thou shalt have not only no nuclear weapon program, but no access to nuclear technologies, or whether it's a minimalist approach. Thou shalt be allowed to have access to nuclear technologies, but you will be caveated in your the amount of uranium that you can enrich, and it should no longer be past 3.86%. And the IAEA should have access to any programs which still exist. That is a potential schism between the Israelis and the Americans, in terms of, I'm sure that the Israelis would like a green light to go and absolutely destroy all aspects of the Iranian nuclear program. The Americans seem to be a brake on that at the moment, but I think we will know in the next 4 weeks where we're going on that issue.
So you think if they can't come up with an agreement with Iran, then it's sort of go to the second choice, as it were, and allow Israel to do as they please?
I don't think they'll be able to do that as readily as if the Americans were to contribute to that, but I don't think the Americans are in a maximalist position on that. And also, if you look at the history of the Iranians, my view on this is always that they will once again go towards a position where they drink from the chalice of poison, as they call it. That is, the bar for the Iranian regime is a low one. It is regime survival, and drinking from the chalice of poison is what they refer to when, firstly, they had to release the American hostages in the early 80s, and secondly, when they had to come to a determination to stop the Iran-Iraq war in 1988. So regime preservation is the most significant thing for the Iranians. There are various centrifugal forces at work in Iran which could break them apart. It's a fragile regime. Peace and the women's movement means that they are under pressure. So if they can maintain their viability with their internal forces, they would go for that, because attacks by either America or Iran may sort of implode the regime, and there's no way that they will allow that to happen.
Is Donald Trump here at risk of trusting an enemy, essentially, of just accepting that everything's going to stop? And how much of a risk is that for him?
Well, it depends which entity you're referring to in trust here. There's absolutely no way that the Iranians, because of their history of the last 50 years, trust the Americans. They did reach out after 9/11, for example, and that didn't lead anywhere. Should they trust the Houthis? The Houthis, of course, are a sub-state entity. The Houthis themselves have said that they will see what the action on the ground is, and that's reciprocal, of course. If the Houthis don't launch any more missiles, then neither will the Americans launch missiles. And if that were to happen, that may give also some political space for trying to unlock the greatest problem, which is the future of Yemen, and where the Houthis might sit in that, because most people forget that there's been a significant conflict which is currently frozen. Operation Decisive Storm, led by a coalition fronted by KSA, Saudi Arabia, from 2015, which of course wasn't decisive, and actually was the first time that the Houthis did use crew-delivered cruise missiles from the coast, nearly sinking UAE ships and USS Mason, for example, in 2016. So the Houthis have been a long-standing problem. Although they are often thought to be a proxy of Iran, and indeed to a certain extent they are, they also have their own legitimate concerns and their own independence. So they are not just a proxy in terms of everything they do is because of what the Iranians tell them to do or not to do. They also have their own agendas. And of course, the Houthis are the Hezbollah of the north, as President Hadi of Yemen once told me, before they actually became the part of the Axis of Resistance. So they've been a long-standing problem in the northern part of Yemen. And Yemen's always been a problem because since independence in 1990, they've never really been sure of if this is a developmental issue or a security issue. And one of the problems, I think, with the Saudi Arabian attacks was that they treated the Houthis as a security issue, whereas what that's exacerbated, of course, is the humanitarian crisis, where over 50% of the Yemeni people need humanitarian aid and support. And indeed, that's where Hodeidah, as the port which was struck on the 4th of May by the Israelis, comes into play, because that is where significant amounts of humanitarian aid come in, but it is also correct to say that it's where significant amounts of Iranian weaponry have also historically come in.
Given the problems that you've talked about that they've caused over years, that the Houthis, and given that Donald Trump has sort of vowed to annihilate them, I wonder why. He seems to have started that process enough, at least, that it appears the Houthis are backing down for a time at least. Why doesn't he just carry on? Could he not, in his mind, solve a major problem in that part of the world if he carries on and does what he actually publicly vowed to do?
Well, annihilation is a sort of mission verb that you wouldn't generally try and use in the military. It's just too extreme, really. What the Americans would normally try and do, and therefore I was kind of surprised that, in a way, that the Houthis seem to have desisted at the moment, is that a major air campaign, and there's no doubt that Operation Rough Rider, with over 1,000 bombing missions, I think, has been a major air campaign, is then generally followed up by some land operation. And indeed, there was a land operation, for example, to try and capture Hodeidah early in the Saudi Arabian coalition against the Houthis. But one of the things about the Houthis and that part of Yemen, which I've been to a fair number of times in my working days, is that it's been the graveyard of empires in the same way as Afghanistan. So, for example, 20,000 Egyptian casualties occurred there in the in the 70s, and indeed in the KSA coalition in 2015, that was recognised by the Egyptians and the Pakistanis, who the Saudi Arabians wanted to provide ground forces, and there was an absolute reluctance of those two countries because they know the difficulty of campaigning in land operations in that part of the world.
Can I just take you back sort of, roughly a year, when the Houthis really made huge headlines with the way that it got involved in the situation in Gaza? Generally speaking, probably in the last 7-8 months, in the sort of national news agenda, they've sort of gone a bit quiet. Have they been continuing their operations and it just hasn't been newsworthy, or what exactly has been going on in that region that has made them become less headline worthy, so to speak?
From their perspective, it's partly to do with the air blockade issue of Israel. So the actions of the Houthis have mirrored the actions of the ceasefires in Gaza. So the first attacks by the Houthis occurred in November 2023, so within 4 weeks of the 7th of October attacks by Hamas into Israel. So there was absolute support via this sort of axis of resistance. The reason you've not heard much of them in the last few months is that they also had a quietest period to mirror the phase 1 of the ceasefire in Gaza between Hamas and Israel. So they desisted from any operations, ballistic missile or drone operations into Israel. So it was only when the breakdown of that occurred that they began attacking again, and they started that on the 18th of March. And since then, there have been 27 ballistic missiles and a number of drones, of which the most active, of course, has been the attack earlier in May this year, which nearly penetrated Ben Gurion Airport, which also tells you really that there's no such thing as absolute security, and either for technical, human or procedural reasons, the layered air defense of Israel did not work on that occasion. And again, an air blockade doesn't have to be successful all the time. The threat of that can play havoc with your airfields, as we've seen, for example, with the shutting down of the airspace of the Russian airports around Moscow in the last few days. And I suspect that will happen in the next few days too. So that also has a significant economic impact on Israel if you threaten to do that. and the warnings that accrue from that when ballistic missiles are launched. Because, of course, it's quite a long distance from Yemen to Israel, 2,000 kilometers. So, firstly, it's great technical feat for the Israelis to go that distance. Doesn't have to be that for the Americans, because they've got two carrier groups in the area, USS Carl Vinson and USS Harry S. Truman. But it's also a technical feat, of course, when the Brits join in, flying from Cyprus using air-to-air refueling.
Just finally, you mentioned the Ben Gurion attack there. I'm wondering if there's any level to which the Houthis might go in attacking Israel that might bring the Americans back into this fight. We know that Israel has its new plan that it announced earlier this week in terms of how it plans to go in with Gaza. It sounds like it's going to be very heavy. That will inevitably anger the Houthis even further. Might they up attacks to such a level that America goes, we can't ignore this anymore?
Well, again, Trump has sort of said when he was elected that he will be judged not just on the wars that he solves, but also the wars that he doesn't get into. So it really comes down to this conceptual aspect of whether he separates the freedom of navigation issue from support to Israel issue. Now, it's always been vital American interest to deter regional war and protect their allies, and it's also been a vital interest of America and the UK to keep the sea lanes open. So it's whether the duality of those two still comes together, or whether he's going to go towards this notion that I want to be remembered as a peacemaker rather than a war maker. So I think that will be the key determinant for President Trump.